You've got big, bold plans for creating an online business with your expertise. The possibilities are endless, but you need a software platform that has everything: courses, bundles, memberships, live streams, community integrations, a mobile app, and live tech support from real-life humans. Does that even exist? Yes! Introducing Marvelous, the world's most beautiful and easeful teaching platform. Check us out at heymarvelous.com.
Change doesn't happen whilst you're arguing with people. And that was a really big reckoning for me to have as well, that there's no glory in being, the hero of the story and winning on the day, that the stakes are too high for too many people at the moment.
Have you ever dreamed of making a radical shift? What does it take to build a more intentional life? What is gained from reconnecting with yourself, with community, and with the natural world? I'm Alyssa Hessler. I've spent the last decade meeting with people all over the world who have made remarkable transitions in their lives. How do they do it? What did they sacrifice? And what have they learned? Stepping away from convention isn't easy, but we all have the power to reclaim the things that we've lost, to slow down, to change course, to create the life we want for ourselves and for future generations. The Urban Exodus podcast shares practical advice and inspirational words to embolden and guide you on your own journey. These are the stories of those brave enough to venture down the road less traveled. This is the Urban Exodus. Urban Exodus is community-supported programming. Please consider sponsoring an episode or making a contribution so we can keep these conversations going. The easiest way to contribute is to click the support button on the top of urbanexodus.com. You can also become a member of the Urban Exodus community to peruse our archives of hundreds of photo stories and interviews of people who left city life, or subscribe to Apple Podcast Premium to have access to bonus episodes, our rapid-fire interviews with guests, and our new mini podcast, Ditch the City, where I answer listeners' questions and offer practical advice on a whole myriad of topics. If you have a question for an upcoming episode that you'd like us to consider, please send us a DM on Instagram or through our Contact Us page. Thank you for helping me continue to do this work. I couldn't do it without all of you. And if you haven't already, we would really love it if you'd leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever service you listen on. And please recommend Urban Exodus to your friends. I'm excited to invite you to my conversation with Nicola Harvey and Pat Ledden. In 2017, Pat and Nicola relocated from Sydney, Australia, to take over her father's land lease located outside of Taupo, New Zealand. It was here that they built Slow Stream Farm. Their primary goal at the farm is to create a sustainable and regenerative agriculture operation. They're raising cattle on rotationally grazed pasture and are seeking to have rich soil, clean waterways, and healthy animals. All of the elements of the land and the farm living in harmony with one another. Before starting Slow Stream Farm, Nicola worked as a journalist. Her career had her working for various media companies and production houses in London, Melbourne, and Sydney. She worked her way up the corporate ladder and landed the sought-after managing editor position at BuzzFeed Australia. Pat worked as a musician, playing guitar in bands, and as a property valuer. In 2019, I interviewed and featured Nicola and Pat on Urban Exodus. They were just starting their journey, and it is absolutely incredible how far they've come since we last spoke. What they've learned, the hardships that they've faced, and the incredible ways their lifestyles and perspectives have shifted since leaving city life in Sydney. Since our last interview, Nicola and Pat welcomed a baby girl into their lives. They pivoted their farm and work processes to weather COVID. And in addition, Nicola authored a book that is coming out this year, detailing their journey into farming and climate activism, and the lessons that they've learned along the way. Her book is entitled Farm: The Making of a Climate Activist. This is a story about stepping outside of your comfort zone, coloring outside the lines to find better ways of doing things, and standing up for the planet, even when it isn't popular, even when it isn't popular. So I'm really excited to have on the podcast Nicola and Pat. They operate a cattle farm in New Zealand, and they had a really big transition from Sydney, from the creative world in Sydney, to being farmers and ranchers in New Zealand. And the last time I spoke with you guys, we did a feature on you, and that was like 2018. And so much has changed in the world, and so much has changed in your lives. So I'm really excited to have you both on and for you to share your story and to catch us up on where you are now and what you've learned on your journey.
Thank you for having us on again. It's been a huge 4 years for us. 4 years? Goodness.
I've been here for 4.5.
Yeah. And obviously, as Pat said, one of those great big milestone moments was having our first child, a daughter, Clara. There's also, the last 4 years have also been a really interesting time for us here and globally, what with, COVID and various lockdowns happening and border closures, and us having some of our lifestyle choices cut off from us about no longer being able to go home to Australia. So it's been a big ride, which is not just the farming story, but, the global story as well.
Well, first off, I'd love if you guys would just share a little bit of your personal backstory, where you each grew up, the paths that you've taken to where you are now, and how the two of you met one another as well.
I grew up in Taupo, which is in the middle of New South Wales in Australia, and it's a large regional/rural town, population about 40-odd thousand when I was there. So it's probably a 5-hour drive from Sydney for reference point. So in coming here, like I had experience in not living in a big city, because I grew up, although it wasn't a small place, it was kind of a Australia's so big, so it's quite spread out. So it's, isolated from the capital cities, but it's not small in itself. So I grew up there until I left school, and that's when I moved to Sydney.
And where we are farming now is actually the hometown that I grew up in. It's called Taupo. It's in the middle of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So for geographical reference, about 3.5 hours south of Auckland. And it's a small town. It's about 28,000, and we farm just north of that. So that town is sort of our local community, so to speak. And, growing up, it felt very small. And I basically left as soon as I was able, first to university, and then moved overseas, as so many New Zealanders and Australians actually for that matter do, to pursue work opportunities and life and travel and all of that fun stuff, which is how I ended up in Australia and did a stint in London, and then came back to Sydney in 2009. And I met Pat probably 4 weeks after I arrived, I think.
Just through a mutual friend of your flatmate.
Yeah, which was kind of the context. We actually met first at a really, really great live music venue called the Annandale Hotel, which is no longer, unfortunately. And they were hosting a Anzac Day or Easter. They were hosting a weekend music festival, and that was the first time we met through this friend. And that's sort of been a theme for us all the way through our relationship, as we, we're grounded by this love of music and arts and culture, and that sort of sustained us for a really long time when we were living in Sydney. I was working in the arts, and Pat was, constantly involved in live music and playing it and consuming it and all that kind of stuff. And then we left all that behind and moved to a farm in the middle of the North Island. Yeah, and there goes the live music scene.
What was the early days of that transition like for you both? Because you really did step out. I mean, I know it was you returning home, Nicola, but you really stepped out of your comfort zones. What did it feel like those first couple of years to kind of adapt to this new lifestyle you were pursuing?
My most piercing recollection of that moment, that period of time, was there was an enormous amount of energy and enthusiasm from both of us in the first couple of months. And we came onto the farm and we had to learn how to farm, and we started what we call rearing calves, which is looking after baby cattle. And that very soon transitioned into just an absolute grind of labour, 7 days a week. We had no time off. We were just head down and absolutely pushing forward, trying to learn, trying to, do our best at this new business venture, trying to keep the baby animals alive and healthy and all that kind of stuff. And so for me, that first 12 months, which led into the first 18 months before our daughter was born, was just this relentless grind of labour, which I don't think either of us fully appreciated, because we've spoken about this. We had ideas of wanting to change our lifestyle and go a little bit slower and, this romantic ideal. And we chose an aspect of farming which was probably one of the most labour intensive without fully intending to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so reflecting back on that time now, I'm just overwhelmed with this sense of exhaustion.
Yeah, much like Nikki just said, I think the first 12 to 18 months were pretty well taken up just with the steep learning curve of a new job essentially and a new lifestyle, that there wasn't a huge amount of time to kind of, maybe we thought we were going to explore New Zealand and go do this and that. And, that just got thrown out the window. Like when Nikki said that, we were kind of thrown into working, full days, 7 days a week, kind of it is what we signed up to. But I guess we were a bit naive in thinking that that style of farming would also allow downtime.
A lifestyle change. Yeah. And there is the adage, once you have livestock and animals, you never go on holiday because someone has to be there to look after them.
Yeah, you're really tethered to your farm. What was the breaking point, or what made you decide ultimately to take that leap into this kind of unknown world, especially for you, Pat, because this was not something that you grew up with? What made you guys have the courage to make that big leap?
I think after many years of just living in the big city where it's pretty full on all the time, even when you think you're having a quiet week, you're inevitably still staying back at work or having some kind of work function on a weeknight, and then you're tired the next day, which rolls into the rest of the week, and then the weekend's kind of taken up with being sort of half asleep, catching up on all the stuff you haven't done during the week, and then socializing or whatever. I think just doing that year on year, and both having kind of pretty busy jobs that kind of creep into taking over your life, when it sort of came up, it was kind of well, now or never, let's just see what happens. I guess we always had the backup plan in our mind of if 6 months, 12 months, this just isn't for us, we can always go back and just go back to what we were doing. But
I think the constant exhaustion that Patty mentions, we were pretty close to probably physically burning out, but we just didn't have the language or the knowledge around what that actually meant. That that constant feeling of exhaustion in the city was just becoming a bit all-consuming. And so the chance to come back to New Zealand to live on a piece of land came with that sort of romantic sense of we could just live a little bit slower. But as I mentioned earlier, when we had that thought of we can always go home to Sydney if it doesn't work out, well, 18 months passed and then another 6, and suddenly we were in COVID, and that had basically
that window kind of closed,
disappeared because New Zealand locked down for a significant portion. So due to circumstance, we also just had that moment of, well, we're really here and locked in now. And there were a lot of things, and we can talk about this more, that led us to a tipping point of changing the way that we managed the land and did things on the farm significantly. But it also coincided with that moment of realization that we'd started farming the wrong way and we were working too hard, and everything that we moved here for had disappeared. We'd lost sight of it. And then COVID happened and we were financially strapped. And so we had to force a big decision about the way we farmed here.
So even as farmers, you really had to pivot and reevaluate. And in some ways, the hand was forced that, there was no plan B like you thought maybe you had. I'd love for you to talk about, what realizations you had about your business and the changes that you implemented so that you could live a more sustainable way, or at least not have that same burnout that you were trying to escape from the city.
I think the realization that we were stuck into a system of farming, or a tradition of farming here, that was very conventional, and it was rooted in an export industry, and it was, very much tethered to a constant churn of manipulating the land. And it felt very out of step with our core values and what we wanted to do as farmers, but also as people. And so Pat basically went on this big exploration of different farming practices and how they were being applied to different land around New Zealand, but also around the world. And he, the University of YouTube is a marvel, by the way, when it comes to farming knowledge. So it was through Patty's experimentation with different sort of farming techniques and knowledge systems that sort of precipitated our change to the business model. Do you want to talk about why you wanted to change a bit?
Yeah, I guess like when we first got here and had no idea what to do, you seek advice off whether it's neighbours or, people in the industry or people at the farm supply stores that, we were in contact with these people and saying, we've got this problem, what should we do? And every single part of the advice that we got universally off everyone just didn't sit right, because it was all to do with, like Nikki sort of mentioned, manipulating the land. Like it was all to do with, you need to add this synthetic fertilizer to boost production and make things happen unnaturally out of season, and all this kind of stuff was like, and probably still is, the only advice that we were given. And we dabbled with that because we didn't know anything else, and it turned out it was like very expensive, not that effective really. And that's what led to the kind of realization that like this can't be the right way to do this. It doesn't feel right. It's not what we kind of believe in. And that like Nikki said, led to the search for better solutions on how to manage the land essentially.
And we joined a group of, I suppose, like-minded farmers who were sort of pursuing some of these new methods themselves, and we were having webinars and whatnot and sharing information and hearing from guest speakers, and felt that there was a little bit more of a community building around this new style of farming in New Zealand. They weren't necessarily next door to us physically, but they were there, which was comforting. And I suppose the best way to describe the style of farming that we do here now is drawing on principles of regenerative agriculture, which has currency in the US, certainly drawing on principles of agroecology, which is a lot more of a UK term, but it's also very much grounded in the specific land that we farm on, which has its nuances and its difficulties for a bunch of reasons. So it is basically just farming with the acknowledgement that we are farming for a specific piece of land, rather than applying a template of conventional farming onto it.
I'd love to know specifically what changes you've implemented and what your schedules look like now because of those changes. Probably
the main ones is like we blanket stopped like applying any synthetic fertilizer. So we don't use that much fertilizer at all, but we've only used like natural fertilizers like seaweed based and fish based fertilizers.
And then we use the fertilizer that comes out of the rear end of the cattle.
The most readily available fertilizer.
Yeah, so to do that, it's just a massive change in the grazing practices. So instead of like traditional set stocking where you may just have a certain amount of cattle in a portion of the farm that stay there for quite a while and just make it work, we put all our animals in one big mob and move them, depending on the paddock size, usually once a day, sometimes twice a day, because we do have some quite small paddocks. So the idea of that is that they're non-selective of what they're eating, because they're in a big mob, so they'll chew the pasture evenly and distribute the manure evenly and have a lot of hoof pressure to sort of mix it all up essentially, and then move on to the next paddock, and that paddock will get rested for, a decent amount of time depending on season, instead of, when we first started and didn't know what we were doing, we'd sort of have little bits and pieces of cattle here, there and everywhere. And
we never had any grass.
Yeah, essentially.
And the roll-on impact of just changing the way we manage stock is really visible to the eye suddenly. We've had, a phenomenal, like the pasture and the grasslands have really improved in terms of quality and diversity. We're having an enormous amount of new insect life and bird life come onto the property because they've got food. So some really simple techniques and the cutting out of inputs has actually created a thriving little ecosystem on the farm, which is actually visible to us, which is incredible. And I think it's also that philosophy has also benefited some of the neighbouring projects that are happening. We farm next to a waterway which is being rejuvenated by a landowner in collaboration with the local hapu, which is a Māori tribe. And they have spent hours and hours and hours planting tens of thousands of native species all along the waterway to try and rejuvenate it and turn it back into a wetland, which it once was. And so we are really mindful of the commitment that is being shown to rehabilitate that waterway, which is such an important waterway for the hapu. And so the way that we farm is also mindful of not doing anything detrimental to that rejuvenation project. So no sediment, no slippage, nitrogen leaching because we're not doing synthetic fertilizing. So the way that we apply our farming techniques is also in response to some of the work that other members of the community are doing. And that kind of philosophy is really grounded in, I suppose, a different way of farming that we're excited about, which is that, that idea of drawing on regenerative principles is also to acknowledge that there are different knowledge systems that feed into the way that land is managed. And, that's really exciting to us. It's not all about fueling or funneling everything we do into a market economy, because there's many ways to think about land management and many ways to think about food production.
It's oftentimes, either first generation farmers or people that are kind of experimenting in farming where you step outside the norms of convention. And I think that as people are seeing young farmers experimenting in this way and actually having success and seeing things kind of come back to life, be restored, I'm wondering how your community has responded to that. Because I also think that it's hard to step outside of convention when everybody has done something the same way forever. And, any inroads that you've made with your community to just kind of show them what you're doing and that, maybe they could try some of those things for themselves.
The landowner, because we lease this property, the landowners are really happy and supportive of it.
You want to talk about the old guard though?
Yeah, but that's in contrast to a lot of farmers in New Zealand and around here are of retirement or older age, and they're very stuck in their ways, so they sort of don't see any benefit to changing from the way they know.
I suppose the worst example of it is there's just outward laughter. They think we are amusing and a little bit odd, and it's easy to dismiss what you don't know or don't understand. It's cast off as a bit of a joke, so let's move on. But there has been a groundswell of interest in some of the techniques that Patty has been using over the last couple of years. Very recently, in the last maybe 6 to 8 months, because market forces being what they are, people are being forced into doing things differently because of government regulation, but also just some pragmatic things like the cost of fertilizer has skyrocketed. So suddenly people are looking to do farming differently because they can't afford to do it the other way around. So these kind of pressures that come into the community has shifted some of the comments that are directed our way or directed towards the type of farming that we do. But there is sort of still an underlying cynicism amongst the old guard that nothing's broken, therefore you don't need to change anything. New Zealand is the most efficient farming that there is on the planet, so let's just keep going as is. That's the sort of mentality that exists amongst a vast portion of New Zealand's landowners and farmers. And so when we come in and we have some ideas and prove that it works, a lot of people are either dismissive or they think it's a joke, or they'll look and consider but not openly support. There's never a lot of open support. They'll go away and consider, oh, maybe I might just trial that but not tell anyone that I'm doing it, the fear of being ridiculed by their own cohort.
Calling all small business owners. Are you looking to expand your customer base beyond the reach of your local community? Speak to our loyal audience of over 38,000 listeners by sponsoring an episode of the Urban Exodus podcast. For more information, visit urbanexodus.com/podcast. New Zealand is unique in that the guidelines for animal husbandry have become highly regulated and very transparent in recent years. And I wondered if you could speak to why that is and what that means to you both as cattle ranchers now.
It actually just fits with the way that we work with animals anyway. There have been some significant changes to the animal welfare codes in just the last 2 or 3 years, but nothing that has come in has changed the way that we do things anyway. So
we don't know any different, really, because
we've always had a very, I don't want to say soft way of working with cattle, but it's a cattle-centric way of working with them. So, responding to animal instinct rather than trying to force animals to do it the human way is key to what we do, whether it's, the way that Pat musters or the way that we, move them around the land or the way we work with them in the yards. And that doesn't necessarily always go according to plan because animals will be animals. But we've not had a problem with the changes to the welfare code at all. And it's, it's been interesting to work really closely with our vets, for example, because some of the code changes means we, get vets in to do specific procedures at certain times of the year. And, a lot of it is around, pain management when animals have to have, things treated, or the way that we don't or do administer antibiotics if an animal is unwell. So it has been, relatively easy for us to work through those changes.
Nicola, you wrote and produced a podcast miniseries called The Carnivore's Crisis. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about what the carnivore's crisis is and what your views on meat consumption are and how they've evolved since you've embarked on this journey.
So A Carnivore's Crisis was an 8-part audio documentary that was commissioned by Audible, and it's still available to listen on an Audible app. And it was hosted by Rachel Koo, who is a British-born cook and broadcaster who actually lives in Sweden at the moment. And it set out to answer the question, does meat and dairy production need to die in order for the planet to live? It was produced in that window where there was a lot of media coverage of the reports that were looking at sustainable food systems and non-sustainable food systems and the impact on the environment. And there was a lot of rhetoric that a plant-based diet was the best way for individuals to contribute to the climate mitigation issue. And so we recorded storylines and material in New Zealand and Australia and the UK and the US and tried to cover sort of the Western food system, and came to a conclusion that has been asked and answered elsewhere, but an end to animal husbandry and dairy and meat production wasn't the answer to solving climate change.
All right, so I would love to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about farming and climate change. This is the second day that we've done this interview. We've had a little cut out, so if it feels like the audio levels are different, it's because New Zealand just had a huge weather event, and we were just talking about that offline. So Nicola, the topic of your new book that's coming out is farming and climate change. And I know that you guys have been experimenting and trying to do things a little bit different. And that's the way that a lot of new farmers coming into the field are starting to function, because they're trying to adapt to rapidly changing environment. So I'd love for you to share what the book is about and your process of writing that book while also farming, while also being a mother, while also doing all of these other pieces as well.
Sure. So the book is titled Farm, The Making of a Climate Activist, which is fairly explanatory of what the content of the book is about. It is a personal a personal narrative. So I wrote it as a reported memoir using Pat and my experience of coming into farming, having spent the vast majority of our adult life in a big city or big cities, and coming into a community and a farming industry with a set of values and a worldview that was molded by urban life rather than rural communities. And with that came some assumptions and expectations about what we would like to have seen others do on farms, how food was produced, what farmers were doing in terms of an environmental footprint, what farmers were doing to improve their land and environment in the face of climate change. And we were constantly confronted and challenged by what was initially inertia. In some pockets, it was completely dismissed. Our concerns about what was happening to the land were sort of written off as a bit of a joke, and it's a phase and it will pass. And we put those conversations into the camp of outright climate denialists, which there are still many, and that's for them to grapple with, because as you pointed out, New Zealand has had yet another flooding event over the last couple of days, last week.
Yeah.
Last few days, and a big portion of the top of the South Island is now completely underwater, and they are facing months of cleanup. And it is a common story. We've had storm after storm this winter and flooding events for months. So it's not an uncommon story because, as you have pointed out, it's happening all over the world. So these events started happening when we first came into farming. And so we started exploring ways in which we could be more flexible in our farm business and roll with the weather patterns, as opposed to finding them frightening and an obstacle that was just impossible to overcome, which I suppose if you're relying on tradition and templating farming with the same processes year in, year out, these enormous weather events are absolutely terrifying because they can wipe out your entire business model in one go. And so the way that Pat was starting to incorporate some of the ideas around regenerative agriculture into our farming system was focused on being flexible enough to move with the weather and move with the climate and move with the way that the land was changing, and to have a business model that was grounded by the fact that the land is changing and the climate is too. And we wanted to still keep farming, we wanted to still produce food. And so that flexibility is what I essentially wrote the book around, is, you know, how do you come into farming as two people from a city background who are new to this, with a view to change some of it and still survive whilst doing it. So it's a very, like I said, a personal story that explores how human relationships can guide change, but also how human relationships can break down if the barriers to understanding and the barriers across knowledge systems are too great to find common ground. And that is still a reality for us. We have people in our life who perhaps just don't see value in what we're doing. And unfortunately, it's a bit of a vice versa. We, struggle with some of the traditions and the older practices that have taken deep root here in New Zealand as well. So it's an exploration for a lot for city readers as well, into how to understand farming practices and how to find common ground with people when we're talking about climate change, essentially.
This is something that, having interviewed people all over the world, there's this people moving from cities, moving into rural communities, wanting to do things differently. Change is a hard thing to happen in those areas. I wondered how you've made inroads with people, and if you feel like you have built a community there that feels supportive of what you're doing. And then second question, which really ties in more to the book, I'd love to know the processes that you've discovered and what's working for you, because I think that there are so many young farmers that are trying to figure out, how do we keep up with this? Because it's a constantly moving and evolving thing, and you're at odds with the weather all the time now.
To your first question, I have done a lot of thinking and research around strategies for change, essentially. And when I first came back to Aotearoa and back to this community, I was in the habit of arguing with people a lot with the assumption that, my worldview was the better worldview and the one that would put us in good stead to move into the future. And what I have discovered over the past few years is there are always different viewpoints that will create blockages, but I think it is imperative that those at odds pause for a moment and try and appreciate where those viewpoints are coming from and the knowledge systems that underpin them, and then to try and find a common space where concerns can be aired and commonalities can be found. I did a lot of research around, some really established practices like behavioural change, cognitive dissonance, all of that kind of stuff, which is fascinating. But I also found it really frustrating because it didn't feel like it was fresh enough to create this, something new that I think we all need in the farming space, but also in life in general. And so I started looking at ways for, I suppose, new system design and strategies for proving your point rather than arguing the point, which is where Pat and I finally, I think, after some, tumultuous years of trying to figure out how to work together as well, we got a really interesting rhythm going in that Pat is very practical and just got on with the act of creating a new style of farming and a new way of doing it here on this land. And so it was incumbent on me to just kind of learn from him as I was also trying to communicate what we were trying to do to others who were interested, but also just understand that change doesn't happen whilst you're arguing with people. And that was a really big reckoning for me to have as well, that there's no glory in being, the hero of the story and winning on the day, that the stakes are too high for too many people at the moment. So I have actually learned an enormous amount of Pat just from Pat, just by watching him get on with the job of doing things differently.
Yeah, mainly just the grazing methods is probably our main difference than what conventional farmers in the area do, like by putting all our stock together and rotating through our paddocks quite quickly rather than let them demolish everything, and then that creates, like what Nikki was mentioning with the floods and everything, creates problems with the water runoff, like compaction and whatnot. We don't really have that problem so much anymore because of leaving more residual in the growth and not exposing bare soil and things like that a lot of farmers around our area put in winter crops, as the grass doesn't really grow here much at all over winter. But we've found that we don't actually need to do that with our grazing system, and probably stocking more appropriately to the land size and style rather than stocking as much as you can, and then when it gets tight, bringing in food from elsewhere, which seems to be the normal done thing here.
And we had a realization that these simple changes started to change the environment around us as well. It brought in a lot more life in general. So the insect population started booming, and they weren't considered pests. They were just part of, our ecosystem. The bird life has just gone crazy. It's like we're running a bird sanctuary now, and we had all of these sort of roll-on effects just by treating the land in a different way, and that allows us to feel like we're within a living system. And so our role is not to suppress that or to dominate it, but to work within it. And we have production animals like our cattle are beef cattle, so they are destined to be food. And it is imperative for us that they, live a good, healthy, happy life whilst they're on the land. And their demeanour and their playfulness is really evident that system is working for them as well as for us. So it feels like we're doing some things right because everything around us is really starting to work in the way that it should.
How often do you move paddocks, and how much space do you give your cattle, and how do you move them? Like, do you feel like you're spending more time now in the actual movement of cattle, or is it less time in your overall running?
I think generally it's less time because we only have one mob most of the year. So when you move, sometimes if it's an adjoining paddock, sometimes it's as simple as opening the gate and they will, they're ready for the next move.
They're instinctively going to go in. Yeah.
Like the dog or the motorbike or whatever, they do the move for you. So in many ways it can be quicker, but our farm is not uniformly divided up. So there's quite a variety in sizes of paddocks, and also the slope of the paddock and the way it faces will determine how much growth you get. So, sometimes I might move twice a day on a small paddock, and other times I might leave them in a really big paddock for 2 days. So it's all like not guesswork. I've kind of worked it out, but like there's no sort of uniform thing. Like I move once a day at 8:30 a.m. Like it just doesn't work like that on this farm, and I guess most farms. So yeah, it's definitely, and then different times a year when the grass is growing at different rates is going to change then as well.
In winter, so at the moment, for example, though, Pat's setting up a lot of breaks with hot wires because we're also feeding bales of silage as well, which was from the farm. So we cropped that in October last year and stored it, and that's the only supplementary feed that the cattle get, which is essentially just grass from our place as well. Which is all from the farm anyway. Yeah. So there's a little bit of time and labour in setting up the breaks, but it's still all relative because he doesn't have to be using a tractor. So we made a change this year in that we don't use a tractor at all because we don't have one at the moment. So we went through a process where Pat set out all of the bales at the start of winter, and we're just slowly working the cattle around the farm to follow the bales. So all of our winter work is done, feeding out is done just on a bike, on a two-wheeler with a dog. And when I'm helping, which is not as often anymore, it's, like I'm on foot. So it's very low impact from a fossil fuels point of view as well.
And an expense point of view, like we're not spending money on diesel and things like we were initially when we had less of an idea of what we actually could achieve, and we're more just doing what we were observing everyone else doing or getting told what to do. Like it was very expensive to pay for fuel, which has got, a lot more expensive in the years we've been here as well. So we basically have a almost non-existent fuel bill, which is quite good.
Yeah.
Mainly just use like a two-wheeler motorbike, which it's very economical. But
there are now EV bikes, like farm vehicles, on the market in New Zealand. We haven't gone that far yet, but it is interesting to see that, in the coming years, it would be quite easy to transition completely away from a petrol vehicle as well, or a fuel vehicle.
I just wanted to give an enormous thank you to all of you who have made contributions to offset the production costs of this podcast. It means so much to me that you find enough meaning and value to pledge your support to keep this going. If you haven't had a chance to contribute, we've made it really easy for you. Just click the support button on the top of Urban Exodus website. You can also get access to bonus episodes, rapid-fire interviews, and our new mini podcast, Ditch the City, by signing up for our Apple Podcast Premium. Or you can become a member of the Urban Exodus online community, where you can access hundreds of photo stories, interviews, tutorials, videos, and more. Find out more by visiting the membership page on urbanexodus.com. I think it's interesting because, talking about New Zealand in the States, and I think in a lot of the Western world, like New Zealand is the ideal in our minds. You hear about billionaires like buying up property in New Zealand because like New Zealand is going to be the place that will be safe from climate change. And I would love for you to talk a little bit. Have you seen that influx of migration into New Zealand as of late? And any thoughts you have on that?
It's not noticeable in our area. It's probably more the Auckland and the South Islands, like that. People have the image of Lord of the Rings and everything. That's all down the South Islands.
And there were quite a number of very large historic stations in the South Island that changed hands. I mean, that's the billionaires are gobbling up that size of land and property. But as Pat said, it certainly hasn't been the case in the last 2.5 years because we've been locked down and the immigration system has basically shut down completely. So unless you are an essential worker in healthcare or willing to work on a dairy farm, then you're essentially not welcome in New Zealand at the moment from an immigration point of view. Unless you've got, as we've discussed, millions and millions of dollars which you're willing to invest in the economy.
That'll start to change now that New Zealand's opened its borders up again. It's just been pretty shut off since 2020.
Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting, you can talk about this in a sec, coming from an outsider's point of view, but New Zealand does have an interesting reputation abroad, and it is very orchestrated and well crafted. And it ties in with the fact that our two biggest economic drivers are primary industries and the export of food and fibre, and tourism and the export of tourism abroad. So there is an expectation, I think, that people have of New Zealand, which is lovely and magical, and wouldn't it be nice if that was the reality? But when you actually, bed down here and you spend a certain amount of time, there are all over the world, specific challenges and specific concerns of living in this country. And, the most pressing ones, cost of living is huge. Wage growth is not that great. So the ratio between how much it costs to live here and what you're earning is abysmal. We feel very far away from everyone, certainly when the borders were closed. So the isolation is certainly something that has its pros and cons. And, there's the usual social discontent, as there is everywhere else in the world. It's not a magical land with a magical leader by any stretch. But, it's been phenomenal for us in the last 2 years, because I felt safe being here during COVID, because they locked down, and they locked down really hard. And it was lovely to have those 2 years with our daughter on the farm. So better that than in our apartment in Sydney, where we would have probably driven each other crazy. And, that was the case for people I know.
Well, let's talk about having a child, because that's a monumental shift regardless of where you are living. And that all kind of happened at the same time as you're going through this other transition. How has parenthood shifted your partnership, your processes, and your perspectives?
Just the basic practicalities of it. We went from rearing calves, which was a 7-day-a-week, week in, week out grind of labour, and working together doing that. And then when we had Clara, I tried to do the first season with her in a buggy and her asleep, and I just tried to do everything. I was also producing the documentary at that same time, and I did burn out, and I almost lost the plot completely. So it was way too much, and I hadn't shifted my expectations around what was possible when Clara was born. So it took a while for me to understand how to live a different style of life, and to, prioritize being a mum. This makes me sound like a terrible mother, but I'm pretty sure lots of new mums go through this, and dads, that disconnect between what was possible before and what's possible after. So I just ran on adrenaline for the 12 months after Clara was born, and flamed out spectacularly. So I don't advise people assume that they can just do everything. It's not possible. So we after a lot of difficulty, and me just being an enormous pain in the butt, we found a rhythm where we shared parenting so that I could keep doing a little bit of work. But I just realised that my focus was and needed to be on Clara. And so that kind of settled in. Unfortunately, that meant I wasn't able to help Pat all that much, or give him much time or attention. But we're getting better at all of that. And we've now got to a point where Clara goes to kindergarten 3 days a week, which gives me time to do my media work, and also gives us the time that we need away from each other to just kind of settle into our own lives as well. Because I think during COVID, and certainly when we first arrived at the farm, we were very much across everything all the time with each other. And it wasn't like the greatest working method for us as a couple, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, that all seems to sum it all up.
Yeah. But you really enjoy being a dad with Clara, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Co-parenting is great, and it works if you are lucky enough to, have a business, which we do, which allows it.
Where you can work from home, essentially.
Yeah.
My husband and I, we always worked together. We had a creative business when we moved out here. And when our daughter was born, it was very similar. It was feeling like you could just keep going at the same rate that you were doing everything. And especially when you're farming, that is all in, and the stakes are so high. And especially if you're just getting your infrastructure put together too. I wondered how you two weathered that. And then to have piled on top of it COVID, which for us was a total reckoning of how do we divide the work, whose work's what, how much time does each person need? Just so much communication needs to happen in that. Do you feel like coming out of this, that your relationship is that much stronger because of going through all of these things? Like looking back at, the early days in Sydney when it was more carefree, and now, like, do you just feel like you can hash through anything?
Yeah, like it's definitely, a lot more, I guess, life experience where in Sydney, it wasn't easy, but there was always, due to both having like professional jobs, there was always like money coming in. So there was no real financial pressures, and we didn't have like a third mouth to feed either. So like there was sort of less to think about in that respect. And we weren't around each other much, like only after work and on the weekends, where now it's kind of like, some days it can be from, wake up to go to bed, kind of like in each other's pockets a bit.
I think it also just required us to have a really honest conversation about what we wanted to do in our relationship and in our business, and just acknowledge that we don't work well together all the time, every single day, and that's completely fine. It's, there is no dream scenario where, some people can do it and we can't. We function really well when we've got our individual space and our individual projects, as well as working on businesses together. I also think it made a big difference when we had conversations about who we wanted in our life here in New Zealand as well, and the kind of pressures that came with trying to be everything to everyone. And then I needed to also refocus my attention on what's really important, which is Pat and Clara. And so just also prioritizing, what was most important was, I think, probably made a big difference to our relationship as well. Because I got into that pattern of just trying to do everything for everyone and please everyone all the time. And it's impossible.
It truly is impossible to try to please everyone. And I think this is such good advice, because oftentimes when you make that transition with a partner, you're creating something, or you're bringing something that you're both doing together and you're both focused on and working on it. And it's okay if it doesn't work that way. It's very hard to work with your partner all day long. And that's really good advice for anybody that's embarking on this and feeling like it's not working. I wondered what both of your creative processes are like, and how you gather your inspiration, and how you find time to farm and create. Are you still making music, Pat? Is that still something that you have in your back pocket that you do?
Not so much since we've been here. No, like it's sort of something that has fallen by the wayside, unfortunately. But
you probably did the project with Doug since we last spoke, but yeah, it's just, hopefully I'll find more time now that we've got a bit better of a farm system. That is just one of the realities of the last few years, that things that we have really cared about and are deeply passionate about have fallen by the wayside. And that's probably as much about the role of being a parent on top of everything else, that took the time where our creative pursuits used to sit. But I think as, Clara gets older and she goes into school, that time starts to open up again. And we talk literally daily, weekly, about ways to carve out enough time for Pat to start working on his music again. So it hasn't disappeared. It's just on hiatus for the time being. And for me, because I've woven my creative pursuits into my production business, I get more time on them, which seems a bit unfair, but I also have to try and make money from them. And the reality is that a lot of, I wrote my book from 5 o'clock in the morning through to when Clara woke up each day. So it was just, rather than fitting it into the day, which was Clara's time, my creative hours have been in the dark depths of winter mornings, which isn't very glamorous at all. It's just the reality. We prioritized a few things, and hopefully for the rest of, this year and next, Pat carves out some time for his. So it's about leaning in and leaning out when when we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. My partner is a photographer, and through COVID, there was a lot of push-pull of trying to figure out, which one do you focus on? Which one is going to bring in the income? Like, how do you push-pull, figure out the time for everything? And I think like having that morning ritual too, that makes so much sense. I wondered what you think the future of farming will look like in New Zealand, and what the challenges that the next generation of farmers like yourself and others coming after you are going to have to face.
Well, there's a lot more regulation coming in since we've lived here, which has a bigger effect on bigger operators. Like a vast majority of it doesn't really make any difference to us because we're not using like artificial, like synthetic fertilizers and doing the winter cropping and everything. That's kind of the main things the regulations are trying to amend. So I think that'll have a bigger effect on like the dairy industry and the bigger players. So depending on what kind of farming you're into, but I guess overall that will have a pretty big effect.
And I still feel, and it might be different in the States, but I feel like we're still relatively unusual in New Zealand in that we're not part of a legacy farming family. So the young generation that typically comes into New Zealand farming are often coming back to a farm, and they are dealing with issues around succession planning and personalities and different, ways of doing things and knowledge systems and whatnot. But people coming into farming fresh, first generations farmers, it doesn't feel like it's all that common because the price of land in New Zealand is just insane, and it's becoming all the more expensive, especially in the last year, because New Zealand has a policy of carbon farming. So a lot of farms are being bought up by overseas investors and companies to plant trees so that they can offset that against their carbon footprint. And so just the mere fact of trying to find land to farm when you're new is really, really difficult. So yeah, I think the new generation are often dealing with different concerns to perhaps what we are, because they're coming back into established farming businesses and then trying to navigate those traditions and those relationships, which is also fraught. But I do think that there is a shift occurring, that some of the younger generation don't see the regulations that Pat talked about as all that overwhelming and not that much of a cause of fear, because they, it's been on the cards for a while, whether the old guard want to admit it or not.
This is a question I should have asked at the very beginning, because when you were going back to New Zealand, I just assumed that it was legacy farming that you were doing, that you had grown up in kind of this farming background. What made you two decide that you were going to just start farming? What was that decision? Where was the kernel of the idea?
There was the legacy element as far as like we took over this farm from Nikki's dad, but the asset is not in the family, like it's a leased farm. So
yeah, we're just not land owners. Yeah. So my dad and uncle career farmers, but there's no family farm to come into.
And that makes it extremely difficult because then the stakes are higher.
Yeah. And there's an end date on the lease, which is fast approaching, which requires, some yet more decisions between Pat and I.
It's kind of like, what do we do next?
Yeah, what do we do next?
Do you think now, just looking, 5 years into the future, do you want to stay there? Do you think farming is something that you want to be a lifelong pursuit for you? Or where are your thoughts now as far as like what your future plans will be?
Still a bit undecided, to be honest with you. We're just kind of working through that at the moment.
But I would say, quite honestly, that the community and the place where we're in now, even though it is where I grew up and it's my hometown, doesn't feel like home. And it hasn't been an easy place to establish ourselves. So yeah, that will factor into our conversations and decision making process in the 6 months to come. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for anyone who is considering either returning to their hometown or moving to another rural area on like things that they should do ahead of time to suss out an area, to get a feel for it, to see if it will feel like, just from based on your own experience now, looking back, any advice you wish you would have known?
I would say spend time there in the depth of winter.
Or the non-holiday period.
Yeah. I mean, we have battled with a sense of loneliness since we've been here, because we felt disconnected from like-minded people and disconnected from our passions. So we found other things to sustain us, which is, been good. But we came back, because it's where my family live, we came back every summer, and it was, a gorgeous place to holiday, because it's a phenomenal part of the world with a big lake and mountains and all the rest of it. But when the tourists are gone and the seasonal workers are gone and the holiday makers are gone, what you're left with is the core and heart of the town and the community. And so I would encourage people to take a good hard look at who are the leaders of the community and what the values are and what they stand for, because it's hard to go into a place and try and argue for space to be your true self, because other people won't change around you. Why should they? What's their the imperative to do so? And so often it takes an enormous sacrifice of your values if you're coming into a community that might be more conservative or more whatever it is. And it can be really challenging. It can pop the beautiful bubble that you've imagined life on the land will be pretty quickly. So yes, I would due diligence is definitely my advice.
Does your lease expire in 6 months?
18 months.
Yeah, 18.
18 months. Wow. So you have a really big decision coming up. And you have now been cattle ranching for 3 years. Is that right?
Yeah,
4.5.
4.5. My goodness. Okay. Well, I kind of want to check back in with you guys in 18 months and see where you've landed, because it's quite amazing how you have just jumped into this, coming from, you musician, journalist, and you have just jumped in full speed. And it's amazing what you've learned along the way and what you've experimented with. And I'm just really excited. Do you guys have anything that you'd like to share other than your book coming out, which we'll have a link to for the pre-order? Anything exciting to share from either a personal or business perspective? And how can people follow your journey?
Well, the book project is our story. And that has been a very large project for both of us, both the time commitment and just the emotional journey to go through it. So I would love people to lean into that and to hopefully take the time to read it. They can follow what we're doing on the farm on Instagram, mostly at Slow Stream Farm, all one word. And there are links to the book available in the profile section there. And that's also where they'll probably discover what we decide to do at the end of the lease. I would say that the time that we've spent so far on the farm has really bedded down some of, our passions, even though they are different from city life. And I don't think we will ever stop, loving being food producers or loving consuming lots of food. So that is always, something that we love sharing with people on Instagram, is just not just the day-to-day life of what it's like on the farm, but why we do this, which is to, produce this beautiful food for people. So yes, I would encourage people to follow us on Instagram and to read the book, because that has been our focus for the last couple of months. Yeah. What else have you?
Well, to answer your question about what advice would give other people, I'd probably say, like, if you have the opportunity given to you, or you really want to try something else, you're best just to give it a go, because you can always, most people can probably go back to, if it doesn't work out, you can probably go back to your old occupation or city or whatever after giving it a go for a year or two. So if you don't try it, you won't know.
Yeah.
Basically,
Yeah, I think you'd regret it always if you have a sense of wanting to live on the land or farm. It's an amazing vocation. It's really hard, but it's, so deeply satisfying in a lot of ways. And being, close to the land and soil and nature is also restorative if you take the time to immerse yourself in it. So yeah, don't be put off, but also be practical. You know, it might not work, especially farming in the age of climate change.
It's really hard. And I think oftentimes people curate their lives and you're seeing farms, you know, marketed in one way, but the day-to-day life and coming into it new and also coming into it without like a lot of infrastructure, like it's so difficult. Through this project, I've only met one first generation ranching family that was able to make a go of it. And she was a entrepreneurial powerhouse before that. She had like 11 businesses that she had started, and she kind of figured out all the ways that she could, you know, make an income off of her ranch beyond just the business itself to prop it up to get it to a point where it could just work. And that was so much work. So I give you guys extreme kudos. It's really, really a pleasure to reconnect with you again. I'm looking forward to what your future is for the two of you and for your daughter as well. She's probably had an amazing time spending those like young years on the farm. It's probably been really incredible.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, it's been lovely to chat with you again. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nicola and Pat, for joining us on the show. Some of my key takeaways from this episode. The romanticizing of country living needs to stop. People often associate moving to the country with slowing down, when in most cases it usually means much harder physical work. Sure, the pace might slow a bit, or not, but it's a struggle to figure out how to support yourself, especially when you are reliant on the land and animals as part of your survival. Although sometimes it feels like everything just keeps getting worse, there have been some really incredible shifts since COVID. The pandemic forced a lot of us to pause, tune in, ask hard questions, pivot, and make changes. COVID required Nicola and Pat to stay the course and figured out new processes to make their farm work better, both for their family and for the earth. And lastly, don't waste time arguing that your way is the right way. The best way to shift perspectives and inspire change is to lead by example. Experimentation and a willingness to step away from convention is required in order to find solutions to the myriads of problems facing farmers in a time of climate change. Focus your efforts on amending your own processes and let your positive results speak for themselves. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Urban Exodus podcast. This is a listener-supported program that is only made possible through your continued support. And if you haven't already, we would really love it if you'd leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever service you listen on. And please recommend Urban Exodus to your friends. An enormous thank you to my incredible producer, Simone Leon, and my amazing editor, Johnny Saul, and my music man, Benjamin Bethurum. And thanks to all of you for listening. I'm Melissa Hessler, and this is the Urban Exodus.